Good afternoon, folks, and welcome to the 23rd Annual Dr. and Mrs. Frederick Barnes Lecture in Public Health. Today, I'm just thrilled that we're kicking off National Public Health Week with a conversation focused on climate and health with White House National Climate Advisor Gina McCarthy, who I'll introduce in a minute. For those on the webinar who I don't already know, my name is Megan Ranney. I'm an emergency physician and academic dean of the Brown University School of Public Health, as well as professor of health services policy and practice and behavioral and social sciences here. I also want to thank the Climate Solutions Lab at the Watson Institute for co-sponsoring this event with us. It's a lovely way to kick off this Brunonian tradition, showing how our interdisciplinary work gets done in real time. So before we get started, I want to remind everyone first that today's event is being recorded and will be shared later on our website, so feel free to share. And second, to remind you all that you can submit your questions in the Q&A box at the bottom, and we'll get to as many as we possibly can over the course of the next hour. Advisor McCarthy has already shared with me her excitement about hearing your questions and answering them in real time. So please don't be shy to put those in the box. Finally, before I introduce today's speaker, I want to speak briefly about the Barnes Lecture because this is one of our great traditions here at the School of Public Health. So the Barnes Lecture started under the leadership of Professor Vince Moore back in 2000. At that time, he was chair of the Department of Community Health. It has since continued through the tenure of former deans Fox Weddle and Bess Marcus, and I'm honored to continue it under Dean Jha, although he is, of course, in transition today down to the White House himself. Today, the Barnes Lecture is the keynote lecture and leading event for our National Public Health Week here at the School of Public Health at Brown. It's in honor of Dr. Fred Barnes, who came to Brown in 1962 as a founding faculty member of what was then the new program in medicine at Brown University. At that point, we didn't have a school of medicine. He was so excited about the prospect of developing physicians within the framework of a great liberal arts college that he began teaching Brown undergrads a wildly popular course titled The Informative Way of Life. One of his students, Jim Zisson, class of 74, endowed this lectureship because he viewed Dr. Barnes as the quintessential physician scholar. And I'm so honored for us to carry on his legacy with this talk, launching Public Health Week. I do want to deeply thank the members of the Barnes family for being here today and for Dr. Barnes' leadership in helping us get started all those years ago. So with that, I'm truly honored to welcome the White House National Climate Advisor to President Joe Biden, Gina McCarthy. Advisor McCarthy, in her capacity as the President's Chief Advisor on Domestic Climate Policy, leads the White House Office of Domestic Climate Policy focused on mobilizing a whole of government approach to tackling the climate crisis, creating good paying union jobs, and securing environmental justice. And I will say, as I read her bio, I thought, gosh, we couldn't have someone better to lead off this lecture here at Brown, where our work is very much about breaking down boundaries and silos and creating collaboration. And that is very much what Advisor McCarthy's position is focused on. Prior to this job, she previously served as 13th Administrator of the Environmental Protection Agency, or EPA, and then as President and CEO of the Natural Resources Defense Council. She's one of the nation's most trusted and accomplished voices on climate issues and has truly been at the forefront of environmental and public health progress in a variety of leading roles over the last 3 decades. In her time leading the EPA, among other accomplishments, McCarthy's overseen successful efforts to reduce greenhouse gases, mitigate air pollution, conserve water sources, and safeguard vulnerable communities from chemical hazards, all obviously issues that we still face today, but which we've made tremendous progress on thanks to her leadership. She spearheaded the Obama-Biden administration's Clean Power Plan, which set America's first ever national standards for lowering carbon emissions from power plants, and helped pave the way for the Paris Climate Agreement, which we'll hopefully talk a little about today. Prior to her role at the National Resources Defense Council, she's also been a professor at the Harvard T.H. Chan School of Public Health and currently serves on the board of directors for the Harvard Center for Climate, Health, and Global Environment. So with that, I could talk for many more minutes just about her bio, but I will stop so we can actually chat. I'm thrilled to welcome Gina McCarthy for a conversation with me about climate and health. Advisor McCarthy, welcome.
Well, thank you. It's great to be here with you and with the students and some of the faculty at Brown. It's a real honor for me to be here. I can't wait to run into Dr. Jha in the White House as he enters in the scene. And I'm sure it won't take him much more than a half an hour to give me a call and say, how does this place work? And I can easily answer, how the hell do I know? Because it's just a funky little place. He's going to do great. And I think it's an incredibly, really an awesome opportunity for him to take over at a time when it will continue to be a challenge, this COVID nightmare we've been facing. But I'm sure he'll all bring great visibility to Brown and all the great work that's going on there. So it's exciting moments, but also incredibly challenging.
Well, nothing great in life is easy. If it were, everyone would do it, right? Which brings me to you, because I think that your position epitomizes this, doing hard things. I would love to hear about what has motivated your career, just to start to share with our students and faculty a little about what's motivated your career in climate change and in this work, and your transitions into and out of the federal government over the last decade.
I've had lots of positions, hopefully not because people kick me out, but because I found more interesting things. And let me just start by saying, I am a people person, as people will begin to hear. I'm one of the least bureaucratic individuals you'll ever meet, although I function, I think, within the realm of what the law requires and what the science demands. And I fight like crazy to make sure that people's health is protected. And to me, the issues that I've dealt with, the issues of climate and the issues of clean air and clean water, are all just fundamental reflections of the needs of every person who lives in this planet. And so I've always envisioned these as being like incredibly interesting, but more importantly, needing the boost that they need to get, because the environment was always seen as an ancillary issue when I was growing up. And climate has only come on the scene over the past 20 or 30 years. And it's to me the quintessential public health challenge. And so I really started out my work in public health. That is the degree that I received, is basically urban environmental policy and health, and it's the reason why I think I returned to the White House is I fundamentally believe that climate change is an existential challenge for people, and that we have to get moving at the pace that science demands, because we haven't been. But more importantly, I saw President Biden's framing of this issue as a people problem and a people solution. And I think that's the only way that we're going to generate the kind of momentum for climate action that will meet this moment. And so I'm pretty excited to have rejoined the White House. As you indicated, I was EPA administrator, sort of the first with the opportunity to really look at integrating climate as not just an environmental, but a health challenge. And we operated on that momentum that we received with our traditional conventional air pollution regulations, but also, as you indicated, the Clean Power Plan, which is really about recognizing the fundamental premise that greenhouse gas emissions in our energy sector really needs to be addressed because of the impacts of climate, which we argued pretty effectively was science-driven and required to be regulated under the Clean Air Act. And I came there from a history of working in Massachusetts and Connecticut, running environmental agencies, and also as my beginning, I was a local health agent. So I've seen and done it all, loved each and every opportunity, and everyone was different. But it helped me grow in perspective of how to communicate things, how to work with people, how to look at working across the aisle. I worked for 6 governors, 5 of which were Republicans. And so I've really found that with each step that I've taken, it provides different types of opportunities to use creativity and to use sort of ingenuity on how you move things forward in a way that's legally solid and scientifically rigorous, and you make your arguments and you hopefully convince people that you're doing the right thing for them, not just for the planet.
Well, and I love that trajectory. I think, especially for our students that are listening, to think through those steps that you've taken, starting in local public health agencies and then moving up to where you are now, again, advisor to the president, which is just a tremendous trajectory and exemplar of impact. Can you give us a sense of what your work has looked like over the past 15 months, your key successes or challenges in the White House, especially given that you're really defining this brand new role? This is not something that existed prior to you.
Well, let me just explain that the White House has always been traditionally, obviously, a support system for the president. The president indicates what policies he wants to embrace during the administration. He has already, in campaigns, have articulated many of the end goals he wants to have, as well as some of the positions he wants to take in implementing the law and the general framing of it. And so the White House has always had sort of what you would think of as policy councils. One is the Domestic Policy Council, which is obviously looking at a lot of the more social issues and challenges on the table. We've got the National Economic Council, which again looks at economic policy and evaluates those things. And we have a National Security Council, which are the primary, really big ones sitting in the White House. And that council is really looking both at international and domestic ways in which you can protect from international challenges or threats, or rebuild alliances or strengthen them with both domestic policy and international framings. And so the Climate Policy Office was created to recognize basically that climate impacts all those things, that it's not a pigeonhole, it's an overlay of everything, and that the goal was really to move beyond the framing that we seem to only be able to accomplish during the Obama administration, which was to recognize the importance of the threat of climate, but it was really carried out by two agencies, really primarily by EPA, and then also maybe by the Department of the Interior, because they do natural resource kind of things, right? Like public lands issues. Everybody else was sort of doing work. The Department of Energy clearly was doing work, looking at new technology solutions and advocating, but it wasn't a whole of government response. It wasn't a recognition that every agency does things where choices can be made if you look through a climate lens as a fundamental consideration. That's everything from your housing agency to the USDA, agriculture agency, every agency. And so this was created for the purpose of carrying out the policies of the president that relate to climate, but even more importantly, to integrate the breadth of the whole of government. So we have created a National Climate Task Force, which brings together cabinet level of every agency, as well as independent agencies who come in. And we carry out a multidisciplinary and multi-agency framing to every challenge that we want to address. So if you have a big decision you're going to make that's impacted by climate, you're coming to our climate office to talk about what considerations you're thinking about, how they may measure up to what science demands, how do we accelerate, how do we do this, how do we manage our public lands better, how do we carry out, and so it just goes on, but it makes it a very powerful entity within the White House in a way that I think is commensurate with the challenge that we're facing.
I love that. And to be able to imagine all of the secretaries and the heads of the various agencies considering climate as part of their decision-making process, and then being able to share with your expertise the latest science and updates and change the frame of thinking. That's just awesome.
And Dean, what we have really is we have a staff that's focused on sectors. So we're looking at where do we have the biggest challenges in the United States? And then there's a whole other wing that's looking at the international challenges. that is managed by Secretary John Kerry, who you may all remember. You should remember if you're from the
fellow
New
Massachusetts native. Yeah.
Yeah. And so it's in practice, just have a mighty people who understand these sector approaches, how important they are, where the greenhouse gas emissions are coming from, the intersect between that and the missions of the agencies. And it's a lot of committed, wonderful people in the agencies ready to go. So it's been fun.
That's awesome. Now, you mentioned earlier, and I want to dive a little deeper, obviously this being National Public Health Week, about the connections between health and climate change. Obviously your background, your degree is in public health and public policy, but I would love, if you don't mind, to have you elaborate on the relationship between health and climate change and what that means to you. And I will say, here at Brown, we have a lot of folks that are working on that intersection between health and climate change, and it's an area that we're growing, recognizing that this is the challenge of the next generation. Yeah. So if you could communicate to our students, what does it mean to you, and where would you hope that we'll go in this intersection?
Well, let me just say that we look at climate as an intersect in a number of different ways. Health is one of the primary ways. Also equity, we see as a fundamental consideration. It's a fundamental consideration in health by itself and by climate by itself. And it's also a consideration of economic issues, because fundamentally, climate change is a result of our reliance on fossil fuels, right? I mean, we picked it. The consequences now are very apparent from those choices. And so really it's how you generate electricity, how you power things into the future that is going to be a primary component of any strategy, which means that your solutions should be designed in a way that look at economic consequences to actually produce an outcome that's more jobs and better economy, right? Because climate is a huge risk. So taking that as a given, which is what's a given here, we're moving forward in ways that make life better economically. If you actually look at the fundamental challenge of health and equity, they are inseparable. And they're inseparable from climate as well. Because we all know, if you're in this field and you've reached the pinnacle of looking at Brown, then you better know going into public health that public health and your ability to maintain your health and your ability to have healthy communities is directly related to both the economy as well as whether you're Black or brown. It is so race is a factor in this, and income is a factor. They do not, and those both can't be distinguished as well because they intermingle. So let me be very much clearer. Pollution, whether it's greenhouse gas emissions or what we call conventional pollutants, which are air pollution and water pollution, clearly those impact people's quality of life and direct health. You can look at the communities most inundated with pollution, and you will see that they are low-income communities and communities of color. That is a well-known intersect. And if you look at the challenges of climate and where they're most extreme, it's in those very same communities. Who's living in mobile homes? Who's living in areas that don't have water? Or that get flooded when there is a drought or when there are storms. It is all well-known intersects. So the challenge that we have is to recognize that climate is fundamentally a health challenge that is very often fundamentally dictated by what communities are healthier and what communities are not, and how that impacts individual health. Because if you're already a community that has been systemically not invested in or disinvested in for decades, you are going to be in a community that is not resilient to the challenge of climate change. And similarly, if you've been inundated by pollutants personally, then your families are most at risk in climate, in a changing climate. And so they are absolutely inseparable, which is why when we talk about both the challenge and the solutions, we never fail to recognize health, and we never fail to recognize equity, and we never fail to talk about the individual benefits, both health benefits of pollution actions, as well as economic benefits that can be delivered when you act on climate, and the detriment if you don't. And that way we can try to personalize this issue and build a broader constituency for action. Because people are coming off of COVID, they don't want another bad news story. They want to know that there are solutions to climate we can grab today. If we invest in those solutions today, it will be better for them and their families and their health and where they live in their communities and their economy. If we fail to do that, we are only going to make things worse and continue to get pummeled by the impacts that everybody now can see and feel and taste. So I know that's a complicated answer, but I want people to understand that we are no longer using bureaucratic boundaries to define our work. Those are gone.
Yeah, I actually don't think that's complicated at all. I think it's honest and is a great lens for our staff, our faculty, and our students who are attending, thinking about, because this is so much of the debate right now with public health, is folks try to make it into a political divide. And the reality is that there are ways to overcome that. And I would actually, Gina, love to hear about your work there. You mentioned in our intro that you have gone back and forth between administrations from both political parties, that you see this as an issue that transcends political boundaries. And I would just love for you to share with our listeners about how you balance those differences in opinion and ensure that the work and policies we carry out today are resilient and effective. And I think you gave some glimpses on that around combining the economic with the health and the family focus, but would love to hear more.
Yeah, I think what we're trying to do is make sure that what we're trying to move forward with are not more selfless acts of courage, but instead be things that people will recognize as being beneficial to them. Look, the president passed a bill that he crafted and he got bipartisan support for. That's called the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law. That was more than $1 trillion in investments. Those investments are going to go looking at equity lenses, looking at where low-income communities have been left behind and communities of color, and investing in fundamental protections for them. Now, it's because it's the right thing to do, but it's also making sure that people see that if we do these investments correctly, that they'll see that government's working for them again, that we're working for the people we were hired to serve, not the individuals providing those services, right? So we're trying to make sure that we are talking about climate in people language and explaining those benefits to individuals and delivering them in a way that's visible, because infrastructure is visible. If we start giving more resources to have housing that's livable and sustainable, isn't that something that people will go, don't I want more of that? They may not sit around the table and say, hey, we just benefited climate, but they did. So, I mean, I'm not negating that they may actually understand that and use that as one of their criteria for what's great to do, because young people are now educated, they get it, and we all understand the need to move. But it also is just a visible acknowledgement that change can happen, and that can benefit all of us. So as we're moving forward with the infrastructure investments, we're not just looking at climate investments, which we're looking at a lot of them, getting a better power grid so renewable energy can connect everywhere. We're looking at investing in clean energy big time. We're looking at investing with DOE for huge investments in new technologies and challenges out there to the private sector. But we're also looking at fundamental water resources and how we can make sure that everybody has good drinking water. How disgraceful is it for the richest country in the world to have people who don't have access to clean water? We're looking at getting lead pipes out of the system. We're looking at investments in schools. We're doing a big announcement later. I'll be there with the vice president and with Secretary Granholm from DOE and Secretary Cardona from the Department of Education, sitting with kids, talking about investments in clean buses, investments in our schools again, ventilation systems that will work, that we need to have now. So there's all kinds of ways in which we're making progress to articulate this as a fundamental way in which we can move our country forward, that we can have a strong and growing economy that grabs the next generation of technologies and moves it forward. And so that's fundamentally what we're trying to do. And the successes we've had, have been basically those types of broad looks at how the administration works together. But it's also, we've had great movement in electric vehicles where we've convinced the automakers they're the future. We now have more than $50 billion to spend on the infrastructure for electric vehicle charging stations. We're working with the private sector to enhance that. GM, Ford, Stellantis, all of them are going all electric, which is, if you don't think it's important for the climate, that transportation is the biggest greenhouse gas emitting sector in our economy. It's a fundamental change in the way in we can make progress. And if you look at what's happened in Rhode Island and a little bit on the coast of Massachusetts, you'll see the big wind farms that are being built offshore. Those are going to have major opportunities to change the dynamics in our dependency on fossil fuels and provide huge job growth in the interim. So there's all kinds of ways in which progress is being made, but fundamentally, no matter what the progress is, we're translating it as good paying jobs, union jobs, health protections, and we're fundamentally going to make sure that every penny in the bipartisan infrastructure law meets the president's criteria, his Justice 40 efforts, which means that 40% of the benefits of those investments must go to communities left behind. And that's completely different way in which to structure the work ahead than I've ever seen before.
I love it. May that continue across climate change and health, but also across all other sectors of society. Thank you for leading that shift in perspective. I'm going to go to, I could ask 16 questions about each of the things that you mentioned. I will say that when I get off of moderating this, I'm going to tweet out the fact that these are not about selfless acts of courage, because I think so much of climate change has been done in that way, so much of public health change, but that this is about structural shifts as well. I do want to ask a question that's come up a bunch already in the Q&A, as well as one of my pre-written questions was about what are some of the most pressing issues that come to mind. And one of our guests actually asked what research gaps in climate health research specifically in the US, but you can also talk international, would you prioritize from your vantage point in the White House? If you could tell people where you want us to focus going forward, what do you see as the most pressing things for us to tackle from an academic perspective in the next few years?
There's a couple of things I'd like to put on your plate. And one of the great things that I'm seeing happening now is that public health schools are getting engaged. Public health professionals are getting engaged, which if you are a physician, as you are, it really, the voices you have are fundamentally important in communicating climate change. Let me first say that when I worked for the Obama administration, half of the questions I got when I went to hearings on the Hill were questioning whether climate change exists, whether the threat is real, or is this just everyday weather patterns, throwing snowballs on the Hill kind of thing, and that is not fundamentally even an issue. Because there's so many already damaging impacts of climate that are hitting every day with the wildfires and the challenges. That's no longer the question. But the question really is, what are the impacts in the health sector that can be communicated, that build confidence, that build credibility for actions on climate that will help get away from we can never fix this to let's all rally and get it done. Because one of the biggest challenges I think we face from the pandemic are the mental health challenges that we're all seeing. And the fact that we don't need more agony to face, we need more hope to embrace. So I really want folks to think about in the health sector how their voices can be heard, whether you're a public health advocate or whether you're a physician, because your voices matter. They provide credibility to this issue. They can make direct challenges between clean air and climate and how that happens so that you can get away from the partisanship that some of us can never get away from. You have to break through that. And there's a lot of activity in the public health field to organize physicians and, most importantly, frankly, nurses who are more trusted advisors than probably anybody in the field and beyond. And if you can get out there and talk to communities and individuals in a way that gets rid of the politics and talks about real life experience, it would be great. The second thing in the arena of public health is that I do not think that the public health world is thinking enough about two things: the actual greenhouse gas emissions from the health sector, which if you were a country, you'd rank very, very high. You know, we have to get away from hospitals actually having big oil burners or some living in the areas of coal-fired power plants without starting to challenge how you wean off of that yourself. Look at the F gases that are emitted from emergency rooms every day, you know, and look at also the challenges that a changing climate poses for prescriptions you actually give or other treatment without thinking about climate consequences. The very clearest example I can give is that heat stress from climate is the major killer. It's more than all other impacts from climate combined. And that means if you have really hot weather, mostly communities who are elderly or communities that have poor housing cannot make the adjustment they need in heat stress. And communities have lost in the past 5,000 people from heat stress issues like this, and probably more than that in many other countries. And so we have to think about giving elderly diuretics without wondering what that means for them when you have high heat days and they don't drink a lot of fluids. So folks out there listening, New York has this really cool little community program where neighborhoods actually, what do they call it? They adopt a senior. People in their own community identify who the elderly are so they can just check on them in events like this and help make sure they're drinking enough fluids. But physicians should have a trigger mechanism that says, how many seniors have I issued diuretics to? Maybe we ought to give them a little call. You know, it can be done electronically, as everybody knows. But there's clever ways to rethink the climate impacts at fundamental treatment levels that I think could make a world of difference in sort of real differences in people's lives. And we now know that asthma isn't just exacerbated when you live near highways and there's all kinds of cars and trucks going down and spewing out air pollution. We now know, guess what? It causes it. Those causal links took years to identify. Now that we have, what are we going to do about it? So why don't you start looking at your own fleets of vehicles and what you drive and what that says to the people that you treat or the people that you serve if you're working in communities. And there's all kinds of fun ways in which you can organize around these things. But you know, health advisors and health facilities send a world of signals. Either you're oblivious to it and things just go as usual, or you can wear your climate commitments on your sleeve and your understanding of the impacts on health on your sleeves and start getting active in your own practice, in your own hospitals, in your own community health centers, so that people can understand how to be resilient to the challenges we're facing, and we find ways of making sure that our voices are heard and trusted.
It's a lovely call to action that I hope that many of us will take on over the weeks, months, and years ahead. I'm going to switch gears a little bit here and move from the health system individual level actions to the policy level. Jeff Colgan, who's the director of our Climate Solutions Lab, put into the Q&A this question. Advisor McCarthy, thanks so much for your talk. Climate change is a domestic politics problem, but also a foreign policy challenge. Can foreign policies like a carbon tariff help reduce the opposition to domestic climate policies? And I'll actually then extend on to Jeff's question and say, feel free to riff about international work. I know that is, under John Kerry's purview, but you certainly have been a strong voice in this as well.
Yeah, I've been, I think Secretary Kerry and I have known each other for decades, and we're a little bit about a dynamic annoyance, I think, at both levels of domestic and international, and not giving up on this stuff. So, but what I'd say about international, number one was, on day one, the president rejoined the Paris commitment. Day one, he did that. And on day one, he set goals for how we were going to move forward, which was to, first and foremost, by 2030, cut our emissions in half. And then by 2050 to get the job done. And we've been living with a variety of tasks to get done in each sector so that we could move clean energy forward and we could address the challenges that we're facing with continued investment in fossil fuel infrastructure, which is always top of our minds. As we have to stop continuing to think that investments in new fossil fuel infrastructure can go on forever. We have to think about limitations commensurate with those larger goals. And so Secretary Kerry and I really are joined at the hip. He has worked hard, and the president is proposing quadrupling the amount of resources that the United States gives in the climate space, because we have to not just address our own obligations, but be instrumental in working with other countries to make this real. And it's very challenging. And I'll tell you, it's extraordinarily challenging in a time of war, like what's going on in Ukraine. And Putin's war has really raised two big fundamental things that we need to recognize in the international world. Is the challenge of how much our economy has revolved around fossil fuels, and how that dependence has allowed us to be vulnerable to folks like Putin, who want to hold communities and countries hostage, right? And so we are beholden to, if we're beholden to oil and as a fundamental tenet of how our economy works, it means we're vulnerable to the whims of OPEC. We're vulnerable to the world prices. And what you're seeing now is Putin's war has both threatened the energy system in the EU, who's trying hard to deal with this issue. And it's also, threatening, not just our oil and gas prices and what that means for communities that can't afford that, and families that we need to give a break to, not a burden to. It's challenging both, number one, the emergency we're dealing with now, and how we actually have to meet the energy challenges with what we have now, which means more oil heading out to the EU and other places, more oil and natural gas. But it also has to mean that we better pivot even more quickly to clean energy, because we cannot give up our long-term understanding of the vulnerability that we're facing. I mean, we now know that we cannot live like this and achieve our climate goals. We have to deal with this as an emergency, but come out of it stronger committed to reducing these climate impacts by reducing this dependence. So when the president has given any speech on the Ukraine, he might say he's putting more oil out in the market to moderate our gas prices because that matters to people. But at the same time, he's saying, and you know, this is a good reminder that this ain't fixing anything, that the fundamental flaw is our dependence on fossil fuels and how vulnerable it makes us. So it's enormously challenging today, but it was fun to go to the conference of the parties this year. I guess it was the end of last year, to really recommit the U.S. Dialogues have been starting. Tremendous opportunities are now available to us to deal with the issues that I've been talking about, but also natural resource protection, like protecting old growth forests across the world and figuring out how to deal with that. And we just have to recognize that we're making progress and keep really our nose to the grindstone, that does not stop, even when we have a crisis like we're facing today.
Well, and I appreciate that message of hope, because I think, and you alluded to this earlier, but just to say it out loud, one of the things that I feel often stops people from taking action on climate change or climate change in health is that sense that it's too big, that there's nothing that an individual can do. And so that message, communicating the many, many areas of progress that you are making in your role and within the Biden administration is hopefully helpful to those listening, to give them a little extra kick in the pants that we can all do something.
I also think that, you know, we have this in the environmental community, and I can say this with all love and affection because I've been in the environmental community my whole life. We tend to always look at the end goal, which is great, but not celebrate successes along the way we should, because that's the only way you get momentum, right? I always liken it to the marathon. There's a lot of cheering at the end, but the biggest cheering is at Heartbreak Hill. When you have that really hard climb, when you get to the top, you're not done yet, but everybody goes, yeah. Well, we got to start, yeah, because we actually have solutions that will drive greenhouse gas reductions down and give all the benefits we want to people. We should be cheering every time, sure, say we're not there yet, of course we're not. But if we don't start building momentum and invest in the technologies of the future, we're really missing out. Look, at clean energy is a winner already in the market. If we could get people to stop messing it up by having now this isn't what I mean by the environmental community. I mean people thinking that clever solutions that haven't been well thought out are the answer. Then we have to start pushing it harder, because we need to look at today, we need to look at the future with every question and every answer. And yes, there's a variety of ways in which internationally countries are choosing to move forward. Many of them are choosing to put a price on carbon. Those both have good and bad consequences that have to be considered. You know, in the US, where we're actually investing heavily in clean energy, we're relooking at things like what kind of infrastructure do you really need moving forward in terms of investments. So there's different strategies. None are ruled out, and Congress is contemplating a whole bunch of them. But the biggest message is that we have answers. We just got to drive them to the fore and make sure that clean energy is the winner in every circumstance.
I love that. And that reminder too, that there is no single solution to any of these complex questions, that it's always going to be a little bit of this and a little bit of that. And any progress that you can make on any one of them is going to move us forward.
And what you really need to do when, you know, most of the big decisions, I mean, the president can influence policy decisions. What he can't do is the law itself. He can sign off on it, but we need Congress to act. That's one of the reasons why we need to have clean energy tax credits that we can rely on, that will keep pushing it forward and make it consistently the winner in every state and every community, right? We need to look at these fundamental ways in which we have surefire know our economy will respond to. and our private sector will jump on. And so if we do that, we'll be better off. But there are many that think that other strategies are going to be important, and they may well be. But those are generally governed by Congress. And generally, you have to watch for the full implications of those, because some of them have great names associated with them, but they may not, in the weeds of the language of the bill itself, it may have sections in it that don't quite achieve what the name indicates. So there's always going to be debates and arguments, but the president has put in a 23 budget proposal that is an additional, $50 billion going to these climate efforts. And I'm looking forward to that.
And I appreciate the caution about kind of getting into the weeds. And I do think it's one of the places where, for us, having President Biden, who is a keen legislator at heart, knows how to read those bills. But so that actually raises a question that was in the chat as well, which is for folks who do work more on the state and local level, or who work in public-private partnerships. What advice would you have to them, to people who may not want to or be able to be involved on the federal level? What do you see as things that people can push for on a state or local level, or in that public-private partnership arena?
Yeah, that's a great question. Public-private partnerships are always I think are vitally important, especially when you get to the point where the solutions you want are equitable in terms of their price, their cost. When that happens, miracles happen. So that's what we're going for. I want people to make money in the economy and to have jobs in the economy in a way that addresses climate change. That's the goal, right? That's always been the goal. And so I really hope that public-private partnerships thrive. And so what I think we need to do is, as the resources are being put out, like the resources that were provided through the Jobs Act that was recently passed, our Infrastructure Jobs Act. When that bill passed, it brought real opportunities for partnerships between the public and private sector. But so did the money that went out for COVID, but much of it wasn't spent. And there's still threat that unless we do explicit guidance, that states won't actually spend that money, and communities won't get them that are most at risk. So we literally have to sit there and look at guidance documents to try to make sure that the money gets spent properly in the communities that need it most. And we will do that, but having that accountability at a community level and at a state level is going to be essential. And convincing the private sector to start investing in communities that have been left behind is challenging, but has to happen. And so there's a lot of what I'd like people to do is to be a watchdog of this money as it goes out, to recognize that we are now have all kinds of opportunities that we're providing to low-income environmental justice communities that actually provide training for new jobs, that provide opportunities for consultation early on so they can know how to apply for money at the state and federal levels. Advancing those efforts are going to be critical to success, because we are going to spend all that money. That money is going to be given out. The question is, who's going to be at the front of the line, and who's going to be the one still trying to figure out how to apply? So think about that and look at the already existing state resources and how they're expended. Because, for example, last week, we just announced millions of dollars, actually it was billions of dollars, that are going to be given to state programs for housing and building infrastructure. Make sure it goes to the right people, the right places. So one of your fundamental ways of working at the state and community level is to vote for people who do the right thing, and also to make sure that communities are active in demanding what's best for them. and why they deserve the kind of attention and investment that they should get. You know, the president's made no secret that he thinks that the middle class was what made this country strong, and that we need to reduce our poverty and increase our middle class if we want to keep ourselves healthier and stable and more secure and economically viable and strong and win the 21st century. So we're not shying away from any of these issues, and we're going to do our best to make sure they get considered. But it's only if people really work state by state and community by community to demand it.
I love that. And I love how you kind of frame, so with the housing issue, for example, as being a great place for us to push on environmental and climate change policy, making sure that people get.
We're actually moving forward with new appliance standards, new housing standards, so that they start better off. And we're going to be working with HUD to make sure that loans and grants are provided to help make this happen. If you don't have a house that's secure and resilient, what do? You know, you're going to be an individual that's living in a community that's been left behind with no political juice to make it happen. We can share that political juice. Those of us with a voice and with our time and resources ought to be devoting it to this effort. I don't think there's anything more important or more that will build the health of our communities and our families more.
We all need a little bit of your political juice. We're absorbing it during this lecture. So I'm actually going to close we have a bunch of student questions in here, but I'm going to close with one of them from one of our undergraduates here at Brown, a woman named Julia Grossman, who's currently studying geophysics, but whose goal is to become a government science advisor. So to someday work with you or people like you. She's curious about two things. First, what type of graduate education do you think is most important to have for someone coming from a science background, for undergraduates who want to go into this field? And then just curious from her perspective, and I've heard this from other students in the chat as well, what should they expect? What does a day in your life look like? So what advice do you give them about their training? And then what should they look forward to going forwards?
You know, it's really funny. There's many different needs when you come to science in dealing with climate or even just environmental regulations or others. You know, people come from all kinds of backgrounds. You know, so I don't want to pigeonhole what the graduate degree ought to look like, because we have people here who have become experts because they've been in practice. We have lawyers that are working with us. And that can be just in terms of how you write a guidance document that's viable and will hold up in court, rather than just thinking that they're the ones running to court, right? Yeah. So, we have people here at the climate office that are great in analytics, because they can tell you where that push point is, where you'll be more successful on the price of climate, and where you should actually, or how you should design and the infrastructure for a power grid, or how you should look at new fusion technology. That may be something that folks are interested in. And, you know, so it's all over the place. And I don't think you should pigeonhole yourself, but you should think, if you're going into a technical arena, to focus on a specific technical expertise to get you in. But we all did that, but we move into other areas because people see you as a person that thinks through things, knows how to get things done. And then you'll find yourself in an area where you didn't have training, but but you have the juice and the understanding of how things work to make things happen. So don't give up on any opportunity, because you'd be surprised at how many people like me never had lots of training in the academic training in the areas in which I work. But all you really need to do is be good at what you do. You know, think it through, hang out with people who know, form teams that can allow you to make it happen. And lastly, what's a day in my life look like? It's different every single day. Everybody says, so, where is your office? I keep saying, well, I work in the White House. They go, yeah, but where? The White House is really big. I said, no, it's a house. It's the White House. They go, oh God, you work there, and they think it's wicked glamorous. Well, look around. It ain't glamorous. It's got a printer. It's got a computer. But you're surrounded by some of the smartest people I've ever met. Honestly, it's young, vibrant. I'm probably the person in the White House closest to the president's age. So we get to hang out and use language that nobody else understands, and metaphors and memories.
TV show references.
Yeah. Exactly. And so it's busy. It's very consuming. There's really never a Saturday or Sunday when you can't be checking your phone all the time. But for in my case, it's finding out and looking at what's going on in the agencies. Where are the opportunities? We do lots of policy memos. We do principals meetings across all the offices on complex issues to see where we might land. But that's only after the deputies have a shot at it. So it is a lot of reading, a lot of work, a lot of emails, sort of exactly what you would think it is, except minus a lot of the glamour.
You know what? That's so true of so many things in life.
Yep.
But
so you got to be prepared. The life expectancy of people in the White House in terms of staying at the White House is like a year, because it's pretty exhausting, except for people like me who we just get it done, right?
Energizer bunny. Right? I'll date myself there, TV wise, but yes. Well, Advisor McCarthy, I cannot thank you enough. I could go on for another 45 minutes with questions, both that I had written down and ones from our staff, our faculty, and our students. So inspired by what you've done with your career, and so honored to get to have this chance to talk with you. I look forward to watching you continue to transform the way our country manages climate and health in the years to come. Hopefully you will not be leaving soon. We need you there. And please know that you have a friend and a home here at Brown. Just again, truly an honor and a privilege to get this time to speak with you today. So
very much appreciated, Dean. It's been fun. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you all. Bye, everybody. Thank you. Happy Public Health Week.